As the medieval period developed, armour became more and more encompassing. Plates of steel started to cover the human body, and the face was obscured by visors and faceplates. That's a problem if you're a knight, because you're a leader of men and you need to identify your own group and they need to identify you. You need the enemy to see you coming and be intimidated, and you want your deeds on the battlefield to be recognised and praised. So how do you do that? How do you make sure both friend and foe alike know who you are? The idea of having a representative symbol for a group of people or a place is a very ancient concept. Obviously, we know that in ancient Greek times, city-states had their own symbols on their shields. But the idea of identifying an individual by a symbol or by some kind of graphic depiction is something that comes in post the Bear Tapestry. And that's interesting because we see no evidence of personal heraldry on the Bear Tapestry itself, which is 1066. And then 100 years later, we see what would be recognisable today as traditional heraldry. So in a period of 2 or 3 knightly generations, the ownership of a symbol that represented the honour and prestige of your house became a hugely important part of knighthood. My guess is the first actual sort of heraldry representing the individual was probably displayed very much on the shield, because that's an obvious place to have a symbol. Probably on the body, on what would be called a surcoat, hence coat of arms, that's where the word comes from. So the whole knight himself and his horse, because the horse will be covered in a thing called a caparison, which is a cloth covering over the horse armour, which would also reflect your heraldry. And the heraldry might be repeated 4 times on the front quarters and on the hind quarters of your horse. So you will be seen to be kind of completely covered in your heraldic symbol. So it's not just on your shield, it's on your clothing. Your helmet colour coordinates, your horse colour coordinates. Similarly, your castle, well, you carve it in stone and you paint over the top of your heraldry, and that shows this castle belongs to that knight. And this is the long family tradition. Your household would share your colours as well. They wouldn't necessarily wear your specific heraldry because they weren't permitted to, unless they were your sons perhaps, who share the same heraldry but with what's called a difference. Your household would probably share your heraldic badge, which is a sub-symbol, and possibly also share your colours. So they may wear a surcoat themselves with your colours but not your heraldry on. Potentially, the colours would have been referred to on the painted armour. Now, painted armour is an interesting one because a lot of people see armour in museums and it's beautiful and it's silver and it's lovely and polished. But there's a lot of evidence that that polish is actually, at least in some cases, a Victorian invention. Perhaps overzealous museum curators decided that a knight in shining armour should be in shining armour. We do know that when some of the armour has been disassembled from the 15th century and 14th century, under hinges and things like that, you can see traces of paintwork. And there are famous helmets that are painted in kind of monstrous and actually quite childlike figures. So it is quite possible that our concept of the medieval battlefield is slightly skewed by a preponderance in museums of shiny helmets and shiny equipment. It is quite likely that they were brightly coloured, at least to begin with, until the rain fell and the mud spattered everything and blood and guts were everywhere. So the medieval battlefield was not a grim grey place, it was a grim brightly coloured place, because every knightly household would have the knight himself, his banners, which of course display to everybody where he is, because that's an important part as well, and his retainers and his supporters would all be dressed in similar colours. So you'd have the gold and blue knight on the hill next to the red and black knight on the hill, and the whole of the army would be arrayed in kind of colour coordinated blocks, which must have been a spectacular sight. If you have a coat of arms, you are known as armigerous. So if you have the same name as somebody who has their coat of arms, you don't actually have the right to bear that coat of arms at all. That's a very important rule of heraldry. Heraldry can be borne by a particular person. It's an individual right which can be passed on to your offspring. So if you go to a genealogical site and see that the Kingsley family, for example, has a coat of arms, which it does. That doesn't mean if your name is Kingsley, you can use my coat of arms, which is behind me. I am lucky enough to have been granted my own coat of arms by the Court of Heralds in London and by Bluemantle Pursuivant himself, who is a modern-day herald, and I bear my coat of arms on my shield and on my banner when I go into reenactment battles. And I also joust under my own colours as well. So I am armigerous and I'm very proud of my coat of arms. It is a modern grant of coat of arms though, but it is designed to look like it could have come from an earlier period. The difficulty with heraldry is everybody started to want it and it's passed on, and if two noble families marry each other, they get to share the heraldry gets quartered and quartered again, and shields and heraldic symbols become incredibly difficult. They become really difficult to actually draw and describe in words, but they become relatively hard to understand on the battlefield. So having a simple coat of arms that stands out kind of indicates that you come from an ancient line of nobility and fighting people. And a lot of modern coat of arms will reflect the modern aspects of the people that are granted them. So people have computer keyboards on their coat of arms, they have fishing nets, they have funny hats. All sorts of stuff can be shown on heraldry, but mine harks back to an earlier day of simpler ideas. And that means I can wear it when I'm pretending to be a 15th century knight. And I'm quite proud of that effect. So you've got your heraldry, you've protected in court, and you want to send a letter to somebody. Well, they need to know it's you sending it. So what you do is you have the parchment written out, you have the message put on the parchment, you roll it up, and you seal it securely with a wax stamp of your heraldry. That heraldry embedded in the wax seal does two things. One, it says it's definitely from you because it's your heraldry. Two, it says that the parchment itself hasn't been opened by somebody else and read. Heraldic seals are fixed to important documents. So for example, Magna Carta itself has a series of seals attached to it. It has the names of the knights, but it also has their seals, their heraldic seals, attached by ribbon to it, embedded in wax. It's sort of attesting to the fact that yes, their name was written down, but also this symbol, this heraldic component, represents the spirit and person of those great knights. Heralds were incredibly important because they represented incredibly important and powerful people. So for example, the King's Herald effectively was the voice of the king. So to actually attack and kill the King's Herald was considered to be such a serious crime that it was effectively an attack on the king himself. And we know this because there is one example in Provence of a king's herald being attacked and killed and was savagely punished by his royal personage. He actually went there with his army and he killed everybody in that town. That must have been hundreds, if not thousands of people for the death of one person. But it wasn't really the death of one person. It was a symbolic attack on the king himself. As the great and powerful were arguing about who ought to carry what kind of symbols on their shield, so the heralds were developing a series of rules to describe exactly what was on the shield and to record it for posterity. So the formal rules of heraldry were invented, and they involved a written description of what was on your shield. That written description, I think, is quite unusual because why didn't they just use a drawing of the heraldry? Well, I think the answer is because different artists would interpret the words slightly differently. And also, if you were going to draw a picture of a turtle dove, another person might not recognize your handiwork as a turtle dove, and they might think of it as, I don't know, a lizard or something. And so the arms would change over time. If you had it written down that it was a turtle dove on your shield, then artists could interpret that turtle dove in their own way. but the words wouldn't change, and the words could be passed on to somebody else to draw them in a slightly different style, but still being turtle doves. This is days before computers. So if you were describing a lion or a heraldic leopard, people would interpret it in different ways, but it would basically be the same heraldry. So writing down the Latin terms enables somebody else who is going to interpret that to do their own interpretation of it, but it's still 3 lions for England, for example, on a red background. They know what that's going to look like because they're going to draw it in their own style, but it's written down in Latin. Some of the heraldic rules seem a bit obscure, and there are huge books written on this, and many people who are more expert than me can go into great detail on heraldry. But one of the interesting observations I've come across is that it's about contrast and visibility to begin with. So there are metals and colours, and the two are combined, and effectively gold is yellow and silver is white, it allows you to have heraldry that stands out on the battlefield. Because remember, the origins of heraldry are to identify you and prove who you are on the battlefield. If your shield didn't stand out and wasn't particularly memorable, well, it hasn't done its purpose. So the rules of the heralds start out as a way of making sure knights had symbols that they were carrying that could be seen a long way away and were very clear. So they get very complicated and they get quite obscure, and as heraldry develops, they become, well, their own science, if you like. But originally, the rules were designed to avoid confusion and maintain clarity on the battlefield. Heraldry is all around us even today, and fascinatingly, the very thing that was designed to mark out and distinguish the noble knight on the medieval battlefield amidst the din and clash of battle is still used today by corporations to mark them out amongst the battle of modern business. But also sport. The English football team uses heraldic symbols to represent it on the sports field. And interestingly, the heraldry that the English football team uses is that was taken into battle by Richard the Lionheart back in the era of the Crusades. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and use that notification button if you want to be told when there's a new video, and we'll see you next time.